G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Spark Your Fire. I'm your host David Shih as always, and with me today we brought our lovely friend Branden Sarafov back from Property Comet. Branden, how are you, mate?
I'm doing well, thanks, mate. And yourself?
Yeah, good, good. It's been a while since we spoke to you, but I think, obviously you're still young. I think, you just had your first baby, which I think apparently was a little girl. So congratulations. I don't know how you managed to look so good, given the fact that usually with infants, you'll be losing heaps of sleep. They usually look pretty terrible, as in the dad and the mum usually looks pretty terrible. But mate, you look like there's literally no impact to you. So must be something that you're doing right in terms of raising babies.
Yeah, I hope so. It's definitely been a whirlwind the last couple of months. Just obviously getting used to transitioning from just my wife and I to then having a little one around. So yeah, it's big change, but definitely enjoying it so far.
Big milestone, mate. Big milestone. Congratulations. And yeah, so I think it's does it give you a bit more incentive now to try to accumulate a bit more and want to push you to that next level of property acquisition? How did the baby impact your mentality?
Yeah, I think definitely has impacted. Probably more so from being able to continue to set ourselves up financially moving forward. Obviously, when we first dove into our journey, it was more around just my wife and setting ourselves up. But now, once you're actually, building a family and having kids along the way, then
Mm.
you want to be able to provide for them as well further down the track. And as I'm sure you know, things aren't getting any cheaper. You know, around not only in property but obviously elsewhere throughout life as well. So definitely be able to continue to progress towards those financial milestones,
Yeah.
just to be able to obviously provide not only ourselves now but also children moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. I think, yeah, it's good that you're looking at it as basically a catalyst for you guys to prepare yourself for even a better financial situation for the future. So that next level of acquisition can come, and using that as a bit of a leverage and push yourself even harder. So, because we all know, like most of the investors, when you ask them, what did you regret the most? Didn't push hard enough, right? Didn't buy enough. Should have pushed that extra one or two more. So I think that's essentially where we all are at the moment. But look, coming back to I guess last time, I think we spoke to you roughly about a year ago. Ish, and at that point in time, you got to about property seven at that point. So you had seven investment properties at that point. Actually, just if you can remind us or our listeners who probably haven't heard your episode, obviously, like go back and check it out. But just give us a quick couple minute summary in terms of where did you got up to when you were kind of up to property seven at that point?
Yeah, for sure. So initially first started buying, being Sydney based,
Yeah.
obviously even when we began our journey it was quite expensive in the Sydney market. So turned our eyes elsewhere and wanted to go down that investing approach.
Yeah.
Initially we started buying in Brizzy, and that's where we purchased our first four properties.
Mhm.
We then bought a couple in Adelaide
Mhm.
shortly after that before picking up the last one in Perth.
Mm.
That was bought, I think, from memory, the middle of 22. So
Wait.
it's probably about 2 years ago
Okay.
that I picked up the last one.
And that
And
was
then since
yeah.
then, um, yeah, since then, so have just been obviously sitting on that portfolio and then gone through the process of selling one of them,
Mm.
which we're obviously going to discuss a bit further
Okay.
today as well.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I guess because you mentioned, okay, so now you had seven properties, but now you're down to six. Now, tell us a bit about rationale of why you want to sell at this point in time. Is it just to take the profit, or like what was the trigger point?
Yeah, so a couple of different reasons I think that pushed us towards selling. First thing was once we purchased that seventh property, as I said a couple of years ago, we then went through that process of having the interest rates rise relatively quickly over a sort of 12, 18-month period.
Yeah.
And so when you obviously have multi-property portfolio, your the interest that you're paying and the expenses you got to pay across a number of different loans obviously increases quite a lot more than if you're sitting on sort of one or two properties. So from one perspective, it was from improving cash flow. Second one was the market where we had purchased had moved quite significantly. And although we had purchased this particular property, it was the cheapest property that we bought. We had tapped into the equity, I think, twice over the course of owning it, and so the loan on that was relatively high. When we got towards the back end of building out our portfolio, so property 6 and 7, we were using non-bank lender as well. So the interest rates on them were already relatively high prior to the rises in interest rates, and so by the time that they can raise rates from 2 to 5-6%, then obviously that was quite significant, because I think at the time we had a loan at about 9% or something like that, and so to offload, it was quite expensive. So to offload one of the properties, we thought, well, we've already made significant gain on the property for what we purchased. We can free up a bit of cash here as well. And then obviously, back then we also thought around planning in mind of having a bit more cash reserve on the sidelines for when my wife did go to maternity leave, and we were looking more around building out a family as well. So probably wasn't necessarily just one thing, probably 3 or 4 different things as to why we chose to sell. And it's obviously a matter of choosing which particular property to offload. In this case, this one was the oldest property we had in the portfolio. And so also longer term, we're thinking, well, it's probably going to need a little bit of work to it if we're going to hold it for another 5-10 years, something like that.
So was this the first investment property that you guys bought in Brizzy?
It was the second one, yeah. So initially purchased north of Brizzy, and that was I think 1970s low set brick. The second one, which is the one we offloaded, that was a 1960s fibre house.
Wow. Okay.
And that was south of Brizzy, in and around the Logan area.
Yeah. Okay. So Logan. So it's one of the Logan properties that you basically offloaded. Okay. Do you mind sharing us some of the numbers, just out of curiosity, like high level numbers, basically, like purchase price?
For sure. So
all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So we picked this one up for $250K, and that was, from memory, I think it was the start of 2020 that we bought this one for. And at the time, $250K was a bit of a snip back then. It isn't massive amount to go out and buy a property. Obviously, looking back 4 or 5 years in the future, now anyone would bite your hand off to get a property for that kind of for price point. Even though it was in a lower demographic area, we still thought it was within half an hour of Brisbane CBD. So for that price point, that's why we ended up pursuing that purchase. So purchased for $250. Throughout the ownership of it, I think we probably would have spent maybe 10-15 grand just doing different renovation work. Okay. We definitely spent a little bit prior to sale. But when we did end up selling it, we ended up selling it for, I think it was $505K.
505.
Which would have been, about 3 to 3.5 years after we purchased it. And within the time of owning it, we had also gone through the process of tapping into the equity of the property. Because initially, I think we put down 20%, so the loan was about $200K.
Yep.
And then obviously as the valuation increased, we continued to pull out some funds from the property to be able to then go through the process of purchasing again. So it was a really good property as a stepping stone to be able to acquire other properties. But funnily enough, it's probably performed, one of the best, if not the best, in terms of capital growth relative to the purchase price, despite being in what an area was most people would tell you sort of stupid if you're buying into a low demographic area, like certain parts of Logan. So
yeah, that's one of the Logan Central, Woodridge, Kingston, type of areas, and it sounds about right. So when did you sell this one?
So that was 12 to 18 months ago. Okay. I think it was the middle of last year, roughly around the middle of last year that we offloaded it. I think since then it's probably moved. in terms of price point, and that whole market has moved. I think a lot of properties there now probably up and around the 600 mark. So there definitely was more room in the tank. And I think if we had sat on it maybe till the end of the decade, you probably would have seen it go up triple from what we had paid for it. But at the end of the day, I think it was more so around how it ties in with what our overarching plan was, as opposed to it not necessarily being a good investment moving forward.
Yeah.
We probably still could have held on to it a bit longer, but at the same time, then obviously we would have been paying a lot more expenses wise with the portfolio. So it was one that we decided to offload, basically down to the fact that it was the oldest of all the other properties, and we thought, well, longer term it may need a bit more work if we do hold on to it.
And the capital growth potential of that area, do you think at the time of selling and making that decision, were you kind of when you look at the whole portfolio, you kind of thinking this property has the less chance of any further future growth at that point in time? Is that also one of the reasons, in addition to the expenses that you were considering?
I still really like the area. I do think it will get capped at some stage, but then again, obviously we see peaks and troughs with property, and so you may get to a stage where it is quite stagnant, as it was basically when we purchased it 10 to 15 years prior to that. So it wasn't necessarily down to cap growth, but I think it was probably one of the, if not the lowest valued of the properties as well. So even if it performed at a relatively similar rate, then we would have been getting less cap growth from it, because obviously with more expensive properties, even at a similar percentage growth per annum, it's going to be growing higher because a lot of them were valued slightly higher than that.
Yeah.
So it also one of the cheaper properties. So if we're going to say basically sell one, we thought, well, it's also not going to impact our portfolio dollar value wise as much, but also will be allow us to get rid of quite a lot of debt, because the LVR was relatively high by the time we had refinanced from it a couple of times. So yeah, I still like that area quite a lot. I mean, maybe buying now doesn't make as much sense as what it did 5 years ago, but I still think it'll do relatively well. And that probably comes down to location as opposed to the demographic, because demographic is still relatively poor if you're looking from a socio-economic perspective. But where it's situated, 20, 30 minutes from Brisbane, an hour from Gold Coast, next to the highway, a lot of those high level location sort of variables that you look for tick a lot of boxes. So it's probably more so just the fact that one of them had to go, and that happened to be the one that we decided to get rid of.
Fair enough. Okay. No, it's good. Look, thanks for sharing that, because I know a lot of people, especially during this high interest rate period, would probably be thinking around something similar to what you're doing, right? It's a time to look at, you've done your acquisition part, you've had it for a few years now, you're kind of stuck because, you've been using non-banks and you're wondering what next to do, essentially, right? So, I'm sure a lot of people are not on the same fence as you are. They might be thinking, should I look at selling one of the earlier performers or one of the earlier players that I have acquired, because that property has already done its due, it has run its due course, and for whatever reason that we think that we should be getting rid of it. And by getting rid of it, it's going to allow us to deleverage quite a bit and potentially allow us for further room for any future purchases as well. So, I think that's the reason why I kind of wanted to dig into a bit of your mentality in terms of choosing that specific property out of your whole portfolio, which I think it's quite clear in terms of why you guys are doing it. Out of curiosity, but you said you sold it at mid last year, which is July 2023 at that point. Was it around the time that, because you could have held it for another bit long, like I reckon maybe another 6 months toward the end of the year, I reckon Logan would have probably be around the 600K, because that was also still a bit of a growth in last year from my understanding. They're close to 600K now, at least based on real RP data, that's what it's showing for my properties in Woodridge and all that kind of areas. So why did you sell in July rather than that basically later half of last year? Or why at that point in time? Is it just you want to be cautious and you want to get out and just take the profit, or is at that point in time you were not too sure where the market is going to go?
Yeah, I think a combination of both. We definitely did want to offload one to improve cash flow.
Yeah.
We did want to start to get some funds on the sideline. And then also it was hard to determine where the market was going as well, because sentiment was quite poor. I mean, I'm quite pro property. Obviously, wouldn't build a portfolio if I didn't think it was going to do relatively well. But more so in the short term, are we going to make that much difference from now to say if we sold in 6 months' time, taking into account the extra expenses of holding the property if we do. I suppose the other thing was the property did need a fair bit of work, like moving forward. And so when we did sell, we spent, from memory, maybe 10, 15 grand, but it was more band-aids across the property to get it into a sellable condition. But really there was some underlying issues there that we weren't sure how long they were going to be able to, stack up for before they actually end up having to rectify. And it was mostly around the roof. There's quite a lot of bubbling and peeling on the roof, but the challenge with an older property like that was it was largely built with asbestos. So when you go through and actually start to make changes, you've got to do a lot more sort of proactive measures to make sure safety of the trades that are going through. And as my property manager mentioned at the time, is like, look, if we're going to do this and that, you might as well then go through the process of ripping all of it out. But then that then becomes quite a significant job. So look, in hindsight, I probably should have held on to it for another 6-9 months. But, there's a number of different things. I look at my portfolio now and I sort of say, oh, I should have done this differently. I should have done that differently. But end of the day, you live and you learn and you keep rolling with it.
Hindsight's 2020, as we always say, basically, right? So, okay, well, let's dig in a little bit about your sales process, because I know a lot of people, we talked a lot about acquisition, but on this podcast, we haven't really talked about much selling. So I think if you wouldn't mind sharing with us in terms of the sales process. And I guess the first thing that comes into my mind is, how did you pick the sales agent in this instance? Because, do you already know who's good around the area? I'm assuming you, being a buyer's agent, would have got relationships with the sales agents around the area. So how did you, what was your logic in terms of determining who should be selling this property for you?
Yeah, so a couple of different things that sort of went through my mind at the time of determining which agent to go with. So first things first was I did already have some relationships with agents on the ground, so that does make it a lot easier. I think if you've bought into an area and you're not really within property industry, or you maybe have bought a while ago and don't really know who might be the best agent to go with, I definitely used not necessarily just for this sale, but for connecting with other agents, I think it's ratemyagent.com. It's where you can get a bit of info and reviews on a number of different agents. So that was one place I did have a quick look across to see, okay, well, who's selling the most properties in this particular suburb? And the thought process there was, well, if I engage one of them, they're probably going to get a better idea of what I might be able to get. So that was the first things first. I think the fees across most agents were relatively similar, so it didn't really factor into the decision. That said, there was probably 3 to 5 agents that I could have sold it with, and I think they all would have done quite a good job. So it also probably comes down to who you sort of connect with and feel comfortable selling through. So the agent I did end up selling through, I'd been working with him quite a bit, and I think I'd purchased for him a couple of times for clients in the past. And so I knew him quite well. I knew he was quite well located in that area in terms of the volume that him and his team were doing. And so, ended up making the decision to work with him, largely based off my experience from working with him before.
Okay. All right. So using Rate My Agent as a bit of a guide, and then looking at the volume. I think volume is one of the key things, like how many properties are they actually selling around the area, and what type of, are they within the suburbs that you're targeting, or are they out of suburb agents? That kind of stuff will also make a bit of difference, right? And when you say the commission they usually charge is fairly similar, how much are we looking at? Is it a percentage of the sales price, or?
Yeah, that's right. And I think from memory, it was between 2.5% and 3%, something like that. It obviously varies quite. What I understand, it varies quite a lot depending on location. So, maybe down in Sydney, it's a lot lower than that, particularly in more expensive locations. But I think generally around that sort of 2.5%, 3%, probably closer to 3%. I think is probably more in line with what you sort of expect in and around Logan. So price for me wasn't too concerning. Of course, I didn't want to just pay whatever. I wanted to compare to a couple of different agents just to make sure that I'm not paying a premium. But at the end of the day, the service as well was quite important.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see the valuations from different agents that I spoke with, because I think they probably ranged from anywhere from sort of 470 up to 520. And all the agents were quite confident in their valuation of the property. So, probably don't necessarily want to just go with whoever gives you the highest figure in that situation, because obviously they still need to go through the process of selling it. But I think that the agent ended up going with, probably had a middle sort of figure, and he said low 500s, which is what we ended up getting anyway. So it's probably more on the money than what some agents are, because I think some agents probably will undervalue your property. So then when they do sell it, if they get a higher figure, then obviously you think they've done an amazing job. And then in the flip side, some may overvalue it in hoping of just being able to get this, the sale or the potential listing through the door, so that then they can actually go on and try to get a price for you, and may end up actually having to come back to you and say, hey, I don't think this is actually achievable now. So I think you probably want to find an agent that's level-headed and honest with you from the get-go, so you have a good idea of actually what to expect on a sale.
Yeah, no. I thought it's usually the other way around. Like they will come in and basically overquoting because they want your business. And then essentially, let's say after a few weeks, and then they go, well, the interest level is actually coming back at this, and that's because of market. So, I reckon we'll probably set the expectation to reduce the price down to X, and therefore be able to sell that. So, because otherwise, if you're just underquoting a lot of times, right, like how would the agent be able to get your business? If they're only saying, hey, Brendan's only worth 470, when everyone else is giving you that 470 to 520 kind of range, it's kind of shooting themselves in the foot to a degree, right? Because they're not going to get the listing. If they don't get the listing, at the end of the day, they've got nothing to sell. So did you experience that?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
I think definitely had some that came in higher than what we sold. But I did get a couple that came in quite conservative. And so it could be a matter that they were just being completely honest as to what they thought they could have got. But I definitely do see some agents come in and basically say, yeah, we'll definitely get this price. I think in this situation, I probably found most were relatively close to the mark. But I have got valuations on other properties that I have from other agents, and some of the valuations that come back, I sort of go, well, that's a lot higher than I expected. So I wonder would that actually take place. But in this case, I think the 3 or 4 I spoke with were probably relatively close to what we did end up selling it for anyway.
Yeah, cool. Okay, awesome. Okay, so so the actual sales process, let's have a chat about that then. You obviously had a draft of contract of sale, engage a solicitor to do that. Once you decided on the real estate agent, then you start putting up marketing on those. Did they advise you to kind of put how much do they advise you to spend on marketing, and what sort of marketing would they recommend you to do in last year's market?
Yeah, so I would probably suggest, in terms of what we did for this particular property, I would probably suggest that the spending funds prior to sale can be an extremely potent strategy to be able to maximize your sale price. And I think we probably saw that here, because I owned the properties for sort of 3-4 years, and I had a pretty good understanding of the condition of it, the tenants that were in there prior, what they were getting up to, and all those sorts of things. But then going through the process and presenting it, you obviously want to present it in the best light. So in terms of marketing, it was pretty standard. We were on the mainstream platforms, your realestate.com's domain sort of thing. I think we had a video walkthrough that was available. So not necessarily just the agent holding his camera, but an actual professional video done. Obviously, you get your photos done. And all those sorts of things. And then prior to sale, as I said, I think we probably ended up spending 10-15 grand on renovation work. And all that was basically, let's get it to present as nicely as possible. And so those kinds of, yeah, that's right. So we did paint. I think it was largely just quite dirty inside from the previous tenants. And so property managers said, look, if we just clean the property, it's going to make a world of difference. And so spent quite a bit of money on cleaning, tidying up the yard, all those sorts of things. And that definitely went a long way, I think, in presenting it a lot nicer than what I'd sort of seen on the exit report once the previous tenants had left, because we did have some complications there as well. So in terms of marketing, I think we probably spent I can't remember off the top of my head, but I would have dare say it's probably between 3 to 5 grand on all those sorts of different things. We didn't stage the property, which I think can be quite effective. In this case, we didn't do that, but I definitely think staging can be worthwhile. But yeah, we've obviously spent a bit of funds on actually getting the property across as many platforms as possible, and then basically presenting it as nice as possible. Because it's, as I said, in a lower socioeconomic area, I mean, only testing it out would tell, but I probably suspect that doing anything more than that may have been overkill. But you may find in sort of more desirable locations that going through the process of spending more money on making it present as best as possible, so sort of spending money on staging, all those sorts of things, may be worthwhile. I think from memory, I'm trying to recall what other similar properties were selling at the time. I have a feeling that if we had spent, say, an extra 15 grand on renovation work prior to sale, that unrenovated properties were probably fetching 460, 470. And I think the biggest difference between us crossing the 500 mark was the fact that this particular property had a 4th bedroom, when most of those comparables were 3 double ones, but then also the extra 15 grand that we got. So by spending 15 grand, I imagine we probably able to manufacture something like 40 grand, 50 grand, potentially more than what we could have got if we hadn't have gone through that process.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. No, definitely. I think depending on the area, like you said, I have a think about it as well. Like, if I was selling my Logan property, right, you understand the demographics, you understand the people that's buying there. They're not going to be multimillionaires and, definitely not top of a range type of buyers. So there's no need to overkill in terms of spending and get the property done up. So I think, in terms of what you have done there, giving a little paint, a bit of uplift in terms of the presentation, that obviously helps in terms of getting that. Now, last year around July time, I think the Logan market was still fairly active and still fairly hot at that point. So it's also a good time at that point. Now, did you sell it to an owner occupier or did you sell it to an investor? Like, before you sell, have you thought about who's going to be my target seller or target buyer? Like, and then how did you adjust your strategy to attune to that type of buyer?
Yeah, so I suppose not just in this case, but also in general, I think as an investor, you want to target selling to an owner occupier. And rationale being, if you want to demand a premium for your property, then you need to be getting people that are willing to get emotionally attached to the property and wanting to spend basically more than what it may be worth in your eyes or the agent's eyes as well. And so I don't recall whether it was investor or an owner occupier, but what I would say is that we definitely did want to sell it without the tenants in place, because by nature, being in that particular area, the tenants are probably going to keep the property looking not in the best condition. I think it was quite cluttered when we did have tenants in there before. We had a couple of different tenants in there for a little while.
Gotcha.
And so the property would have presented quite poorly. And so anyone going through, combination of things, one, it presents poorly, but I suppose the second thing is if it does have a longer lease on it, and obviously owner occupiers can almost be ruled out of purchasing it because they don't want to wait around for the lease to expire. I know in different locations, agents and property managers do recommend potentially just asking the tenants to tear up the lease agreement, and if they say no, you may be able to offer them some kind of incentive to do so. But obviously, that's an option if there is a longer lease attached to it, and many times some tenants don't want to go anywhere. So we did wait until the property was vacant to sell, and I think that would be a big key. And so then the timing of it becomes quite challenging. But if you do nail it, I think it can make a big difference, because from a buyer's perspective, you essentially want to present the property as best as possible to as many people as possible. And so in order to do that, you need to obviously get exposure so you can get as many buyers as possible to consider purchasing. If you're going to have tenants in the property, that's probably going to limit yourself to just investors. And most time investors are thinking with their investment cap on, where whereby they want to basically buy it as cheap as possible. Yes, owner occupiers do as well, but usually they'll be more inclined to be like, well, okay, we'll spend the extra 10, 20, 30 grand because we really like this property. We can see ourselves living in it. So I don't specifically recall whether it was an investor or an owner occ, but at the same time, I know that we did target it towards basically maximizing the exposure of who potentially could purchase it when we were selling.
Yeah, good strategy there, mate. And look, you're absolutely spot on. I think, you will definitely want to target for owner occupiers who's emotionally attached in terms of buying the property. Because if they can see themselves living in this place, then you're halfway there. So I think, whereas investors, you and me are both property investors. You know what we normally do? We crunch our numbers and see how we can actually get lowball these properties for right, because, let's try to maximize the return. So, yeah. So that's a good tip for everyone. Okay, so we spoke about, I guess, the tips of, whether the mentality of whether to sell to an investor or an owner occupier. And now I want to actually understand a bit more about the actual sales campaign. Like, did the agent initially offer you to say, Branden, this property is fantastic, the market is very hot at the moment, we should put it on an auction? Or, I mean, traditionally, Logan's not really an auction market, so I suspect the answer is no. Or did he just basically came to say, look, given the type of property that it is, it's a five-row house, it's been tidied up, I reckon let's just basically put it on the market for sale as a normal sales condition. What sort of marketing campaign and strategy did the sales agent offer you?
Yeah, so we went down the route of doing private treaty. So we didn't have an auction. We didn't really discuss it too much. I think it's largely because of location. In an area where market is relatively hot, and you have a somewhat desirable, property in a sort of family suburb, then I think going down the auction route would make a lot of sense. Essentially you give a date to be able to get all of the buyers that are interested in the property there. You entice them by basically having them bid against one another and try to maximize that sale price. So, I do like the idea of an auction. In this case, it probably wouldn't have been as ideal because also, market wasn't, at least from my perception, wasn't as hot as what it has sort of had been in the past, as well as other locations as well. So largely location was probably the biggest factor there as to why we didn't go down that route. But nonetheless, it was probably a 14-day campaign from the time of launch, basically taking people through on, I think we probably had 2 opens, one midweek, one on the weekend, and doubled that up each week. And then after the 14 days, basically we sort of reassess what offers do we have on the table, what can we sort of do here. From memory, I think we actually had the highest offer was in the high 400, so maybe around the 490 mark.
Okay.
And I was quite adamant of being able to try and push into the 500s. I think that's what I told the agent upon sale. I said, and it was probably more of a mental thing for myself where we purchased at 250. I wanted to basically double what we bought it for. Even though in hindsight it wasn't going to make the world of difference. But yeah, the agent went back, was able to push the buyer up into the low 500s. And I think that, hey, they had probably inquired within the first week on the property, had made a couple offers, and then we basically waited to see if we're going to get anything else that was at that price or higher. And once we realized, okay, this is probably the best we've got at the moment, then we started to work with that buyer to see whether they would meet basically what we were wanting to get. And I think we probably found a middle ground because we initially would have gone in slightly higher, so that they probably come right in somewhere in and around the middle there. But yeah, I think the circumstances of the sale largely would dictate which route you go down. I'm a big fan of auction, but obviously it needs its time and place because you don't want to go into a market where it's where it is a buyer's market, and then all of a sudden, you're holding an auction in 3 weeks' time and you have no one rock up to it, and you've sort of just wasted a month preparing and planning and all that for the auction, and you get a price that's quite underwhelming. So that's, probably largely why we decided to go down private treaty route.
Bit like Sydney market at the moment, whereas there's the auction market isn't very hot right now, right? It's more tending towards a buyer's market at the moment. So I think a lot of auctions are passing in, or even like you said, have no one interested in terms of registering in bidding. So that's but yeah, look, with Logan area, I think I totally agree with you, and I can see that it makes perfect sense to do it as a private treaty, given where we were last year. How many offers did you have on the table for the first first open, first week of open, I should say. Like
Yeah, so I think overall we probably ended up with about five offers.
five
I'm
offers?
trying to recall, yeah, trying to recall when each of them had come in. I dare say majority of them were within the first week. Um,
Yes.
Sometimes I've noticed this both from a buying perspective as well. Many times when an offer comes on table, um, that generally the first or second offer is usually going to be one of the better ones. And so sometimes you get it and go, oh, okay, well, this is a good starting place. Let's see, move forward and see what else we might be able to get. But then you realize they start coming in slightly lower. And so usually the people that are most interested will actually come in with quite a strong offer initially. And then that's probably worthwhile to consider. So I think we probably ended up with around five offers, probably only two or three of them actually within the realm of having conversations with them, because other were quite low ball offers at the time.
Mm.
And so I think once we realized that there was one buyer that was probably 10, 15 grand above everybody else from the get-go, that's when we decided, well, let's just see, we work with them and see whether we can get to a number that we're happy to take.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, did they offer comes in with like finance and building and clause and any kind of special conditions that's worth mentioning?
Yeah, so generally, you probably find most of them will come with building and pest inspection as well as a finance clause. I actually think from memory, this one only came in with, I think it was a 7-day building and pest.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think they had a finance clause attached to it, which is why it was obviously far stronger than most of the other offers. So I think not only was it price-wise a couple, probably 10, 20 grand more expensive, but also the conditions were a lot more favorable.
Yeah.
And so obviously as a buyer, most will know that if you can put an offer on the table with basically the least amount of conditions, that it's probably going to be far more favorable. And I definitely have noticed that from buying properties, that if you can come forward, even if you're not necessarily the highest price, sometimes vendors will be inclined to accept a slightly lower price if you've got far better conditions than someone else.
Absolutely.
But in our case, we're fortunate that it was a combination of not only were the conditions better, but they were also at a slightly higher price than other buyers as well.
Mm-hmm. How did it feel during those 7 days of building and pest? Were you kind of like twiddling your thumbs and go, I hope nothing goes wrong with the building and pest report? Because you know how they can terminate within that 7 days if the building and pest, because I think, Queensland contract is one of those that favors the buyer a lot more than the sellers in comparison to other state, right? So how did you feel those during 7 days off period? Like, what were you thinking?
Yeah, so, and I think buying so many properties up there, I definitely enjoyed having conditions that were a lot more favorable to the buyer, but then being on the seller side, it's like, okay, it's different, completely different. So yeah, it was a little bit stressful, particularly because I knew the condition of the property. And so I sort of going, well, we did do a lot of band-aids to different things that probably will need rectification in the next 5-10 years. But surprisingly, after 4 or 5 days, the report came back, obviously revealed that the property is relatively old, but nothing major popped up. I don't think there was any major structural concerns, and they satisfied within the 7 days, which was good to hear. So,
Beautiful.
no concerns from that front, but was a little bit stressful because, when I have seen the property probably in a worse condition, I was aware of some of the things that need to be done there. But for whatever reason, the seller wasn't too concerned and decided to move forward with it anyway.
Okay. Well, good to know. That's a blessing in disguise to a degree, I guess, given the fact that you're seeing the most ugliest side of that investment property, and I think put a bit of cosmetics makes up now, and it's looking a lot better. So okay, so that's great. And okay, so I think we pretty much covered the process, and it goes through to the settlement at that point in time. Was there any other hiccups from the point where it goes on till settlement? Anything else that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, pretty smooth. Most times, I think, from my own perspective, I generally see finance is probably a combination of both finance and building can be biggest concern from under contract to settlement. Usually not too concerned with finance, particularly if there's a pre-approval in place and you can sort of get your eyes across it as well, which sometimes agents will ask for. And then once the building's satisfied, there's not too many hurdles that you really have to jump through leading through to settlement. Sometimes you can have a couple of different problems, but otherwise it was quite smooth. So I think from memory, it was a 42-day
Standard.
Contract from under contract to settlement, so 6 weeks. And we probably sat on the sidelines for quite some time, because sometimes finance or building can stretch out to 2 or 3 weeks, or it spends half of the time waiting to go unconditional. But in this case, we're basically unconditional within a week, and so then just waiting for the settlement date to roll around 5 weeks later.
Yeah, cool. Okay, beautiful. Tell us a bit about the actual profit that's been made. Is I guess this is your first time selling an investment property as well. A lot of us, like including me, I haven't sold my first investment property. When you do your due diligence, I guess you obviously had a figure in mind in terms of the profit that you're going to get. Did the final actual profit actually deviated from your estimate? And if so, what were the components that deviated?
Yeah, so I think it was relatively spot on to what I expected. And I think it's because I spent a number of times just basically breaking down the expected costs. I think a lot of the times some people will think they'll sell and say, for example, it was just above 500 that we got, but let's call it 500. You can look at that and go, well, you subtract the loan and that's basically it. That's what I should be walking away with. But there's a lot more to it. So obviously you have to take into account soliciting fees, agent fees, the cost to obviously renovate, all those sorts of things.
Yep.
For myself, we had tapped into the equity a couple of times. The loan was a lot higher than the original loan. And then, of course, you have to pay tax on that as well.
Right.
And so, that's the other sort of added fee that you don't necessarily pay straight away, but you obviously have to pay that come the end of tax time and when you do your tax return. So it did probably eventuate, did probably spit out a similar number to what I was expecting. So I wasn't too concerned from that perspective. But I do think some people might get caught up into thinking that basically as close to the sales price is essentially what they'll be walking away with, but there's normally a couple of different fees that you don't anticipate that all add up, and can be a lot less than what you expect. So yeah, I think for us it wasn't too much of a concern, but I can see how some people might go that extra mile to crunch the numbers correctly and then think they're going to walk away with a bit more than they do.
So if you don't mind sharing with us, so let's say the purchase price of 250K back in about 3 or 4 years, and now selling price of 505. So adding up, we obviously know that you spend about 10, 15 grand in between, in terms of tidying up the place. So what was the actual profit, or a rough figure in terms of you walking away at the time of the sale? So excluding the taxation that you're going to have to pay the next year, how much did it actually kind of bank for you, roughly?
Yeah, so I think from memory, the loan probably would have been around 430, I think,
okay.
Which basically would have been 80% LVR.
Okay, yeah.
So once you take into account 505, you pay your 3% to the agent, which is about 15, 16 grand, 3K to solicitor, and then let's call it 15 grand for renovation work. That's probably about 30 all up.
Yeah.
So then we're going 475 minus the 430 left. It was only sort of 50 odd grand that we probably walked away with. But a lot of all of that would have been used to pay off the debt attached to the property, which, as I said, was quite expensive with the non-bank lenders at that time. So there wasn't a lot there, but when you break it down in terms of removing the loan attached to it, and you're just looking at it from sale price to purchase price, again, you go, well, 255 difference from the sale from what we paid. But then we've got obviously minus again that 30 grand that we discussed. So that brings it down to 225. From there, I think we'd probably spent maybe 10, 15 grand throughout the ownership of it to tidy things up. So maybe now we're at 210. And I think the profit was probably in the low 200s when we end up doing the tax return on that and looking at the capital gain, and obviously then get the 50% tax discount. So we end up paying, yeah, that's right. So end up paying tax on about 100 grand of that, I think, from memory.
Okay, so was that about 100 grand that's been added to both of you and your wife's? I'm assuming it was owned jointly in that sense. So 100K.
So this, yeah.
Yep.
This one was in my name.
Okay.
And rationale upon purchasing was sort of thinking, a few years back, well, we'll buy alternative names. And then we actually end up buying in joint names initially. But thought process was, well, we can obviously, depending on how we're wanting to do this, sell off one if,
Yep.
for example, my wife isn't working or I'm not working, sort of thing. And I think when we did sell, because I'm work for myself and running a business as well, I can leave a lot of the funds that we make through the business in the business account and not necessarily have to pay myself as much. So then that capital gain I did incur from the property, obviously would be at a slightly lower tax rate.
Yeah.
So that was a thought process there.
Yeah. Okay. So did that 200K of approximate 200K of net profit basically gets added onto, so 200K and then take 50% of that. So basically your taxable income just added another 100K for FY24 because you sold it last year. Yeah. So FY24. So basically just need to pay slightly more tax, but not exorbitant tax regime in that sense because you control how much.
Yeah, that's right.
You know that the sales going, and you can control how much you pay yourself. So that's
exactly right. That was a thought process there. So I think from memory, and probably for similar for most people, like the tax rate, I think it was somewhere around 35-40% I would have paid on that.
Yep.
So if it was 40%, then that's 40 grand that it would end up paying out of the 250 gain that we made, minus obviously the other expenses as well.
Okay. Okay. Well, great. Okay. Well, good to know. And thanks for sharing that as well. The level of detail that you've gone through. And I'm sure you crunch the numbers because you're a very detailed guy in terms of, running these through. And I can see it's all planned. And it's being executed very nicely as well. What was the overall experience of your first sell? Do you think that, it's something that, do you think that it went fairly smoothly? What was the biggest learnings out of it? And what would you do differently?
Yeah, so I think a couple of different things. Biggest learning was I think timing when you sell can be quite important. So it obviously needs to fall within your overarching finance and investment goals as well.
Yep.
The timing of this, because we were quite aggressive with building the portfolio, maybe if we had stopped at, say, for example, 5 properties, then we wouldn't have had to go through the process of selling. But then we've obviously seen the capital growth of this particular property as well as 6 and 7. So it actually makes sense to push slightly further, even if you have to then take one step back. I think a couple other things that we would have learned was definitely, and we sort of knew this going in, but to see it play out was quite important, is you've done all the heavy lifting and look throughout your acquisition phase. You purchased the property, you've sat on it for a period of time, you've allowed time to do its thing. It doesn't make sense to just then go and sell the property without actually putting in the extra effort to be able to demand top dollar, because at the end of the day, the purpose of owning the investment is to be able to maximize the profit that you can make from it. So, sometimes I hear people say, well, we're going to sell our property off market, which as a buyer, that ticks a lot of boxes from buying perspective because less exposure, less people to look at the property. But from a selling perspective, I think you really want to be able to maximize exposure upon sale. And to do that, you take it on market, you run a 14-day campaign, or you take it to auction. You spend the extra funds to be able to present the property well. You might want to stage it, all those sorts of things, because at the end of the day, you did all that heavy lifting initially. You might as well finish it off by basically trying to demand a premium there. So that's probably the key takeaways that I got, and not that we didn't do those sorts of things, but definitely much more clearer after going through that process. And I suppose the other thing is just not to get too concerned or pressured into taking an offer earlier on. I did mention, obviously, that the offer that we got initially was the best offer anyway, but I feel sometimes agents, because for them, obviously, working on commission, but the difference between 500K to 530K for them may only be, a grand or something like that, whereas for you, it can be quite significant. So as a seller, I also feel, once you've got a number, if you're confident that that's a figure that is achievable, and maybe you do have to speak with a few agents on the ground to confirm that, then probably try not to get too pressured into thinking that you have to take a figure just for the sake of it. Because I do think agents do try to, get you to make a decision a bit quicker so that they can obviously start to cycle through the people they're working with. So, yeah, if there's a figure in mind that you've got, then stick to it. And, if you've done all the things that you can in terms of presenting the property to in its best light, then, I feel like it makes more sense to sort of wait to see how things pan out as opposed to just taking something preemptively.
Mhm. No, good tips. Thank you. And that's obviously you won't learn these until you actually go through the process. So, definitely appreciate you sharing your personal experiences and the lessons today. Especially it's a very different experiences, especially coming from buyer's agent as well, right? Like, you're being on the buyer side pretty much most of the time, and now you actually get a taste of what it feels like on the other side of the fence. So, which side would you still be wanting to be on mostly, Brendan? I reckon would you still be on the buyer side, or would you kind of sit more comfortably now on the seller side?
No, definitely still on the buyer side. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to be selling property. So
Stressed out.
buying is my niche, and very happy to keep to stay there. So,
Good man.
but you're right. It not only obviously helped from investment perspective, but also from a buying perspective, because now you sort of see the intricacies of how agents will operate and what they'll sort of do in order to maximize the sale price for their vendors. And so having that insight is quite useful from a buying perspective as well.
True. Okay. Well, where to from here in terms of your journey? So down to six now. You took a bit of a step back, but this obviously is a great step because it deleverages a lot. I think the overall LVR would have sit previously it might be just I don't know, guessing maybe around 80, and now maybe it's down to like 60-ish, kind of like around that. So helps you from a cash flow perspective while you got your little one, your little daughter that's just came to this brave new world. So you're going to sit tight a little bit until your wife goes back to work, and then you're going to go hard again, or what's the next chapter for you?
Yeah, so I think a couple of different things at the moment are sort of short-term roadblocks at the minute. Obviously now with a dependent, that obviously impacts borrowing as well. I think the biggest thing over the last few years was starting and running a business, and then obviously having to rely on the income from the business as opposed to a PAYG. As you know, it's a lot easier to crunch numbers with a PAYG than if you're working for yourself. So
Mhm.
that's probably was the biggest challenge, and that initially had stopped us from being able to progress further past sort of seven, because we did get capped out with the PAYGs, but then once you go to the business, you need a period of time between you need to be able to show income over a couple of years to be able to then service for loans. So recently, we actually went through the process of refinancing a couple of loans,
Right.
bringing the interest rate down there. So it's been a lot more consolidation over the past couple of years,
Yes.
as opposed to continuing to acquire. But the ambition is still there to be able to continue to build a portfolio out over time,
Mhm.
um, and it may not necessarily mean doing that in terms of just continuing to increase the number of properties, but it may also be looking at doing a couple of things slightly differently, and buying maybe more expensive properties and stuff like that. So increasing the dollar value, as opposed to not necessarily just increasing the number of properties as well. And so I think, yeah, a number of different things running through my mind, but in the next sort of 12, 18 months, just continue to consolidate and see where rates are in the future, and then sort of revisit the buying process maybe in 12 months time, 18 months time, and start to continue to build that portfolio.
Good man. Good man. Don't worry, our listeners. I mean, Brendan's still buying great properties for his clients. So, you won't miss out on that just because he doesn't buy properties for himself, which I know, like Brendan, you must have saw a lot and you go, oh, I wish I could buy that one myself, right? But, when you're tapped out, like that's the most frustrating thing that you could ever have. As a buyer's agent, you go, that's a great opportunity. I just want to get my hands onto it. But my finance doesn't allow me to. So, anyway. So, but yeah, you're still getting those deals for your clients regardless. So, yeah, if anyone's interested, reach out to Brandon. Obviously, he's obviously been acting on the buyer side, but now he's seeing what can be done on the seller side of things. So you would have a lot better understanding on, oh, okay, that sales agent's playing a bit of a trick in terms of trying to hike up the price, and here's what we should do. So,
Exactly right. No, more than happy to have a chat with anyone. So, I think now that I'm not at that stage of being able to buy myself, it's always good to be able to help other people to do the same. So, and you're right, I definitely look at properties and go, oh, I wouldn't mind owning that one. But fortunately, some of my clients get to buy those instead.
That's right. Yeah. I guess that's yeah, that's part of the pros of being a buyer's agent, but at the same time you kind of go, I wish I had stronger finances, but anyway, it is what it is. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you, Branden?
Yeah, so website, which is propertycomment.com.au.
Okay.
Easy ways just to jump onto there
Yep.
and go through the process of getting in contact. Can book a consultation or just shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to have a chat. That's probably the best place to make contact from there.
Awesome. Okay, beautiful. All right, well, thanks, Branden. Again, appreciate your time and your generosity today in terms of sharing your sales experiences. It's good for you to be sitting as a seller and tell us all the ins and outs about what's been happening on the other side. So it's good. It's good. Thank you again. And look, we'll look forward to bringing you back on again as we basically uncover the next chapter of your property journey.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me, David. Appreciate it.
Cheers, mate. See you guys next time.